Chapter 20, Endings and Beginnings. Since I left you in the previous chapter with the situation Dad was in with his health, I want to begin this chapter where I left off in that regard. It was early 2011 and we continued to go through life day by day. I realized that that's the only way you go through life, but if you've ever walked through what cancer brings into someone's life, then you know the feeling I'm speaking of. Some days will roll by uneventfully. Other days, the emotion of the trial seems almost unbearable. It's quite a roller coaster. Kelly and Angie and I did the best we could. As I covered in the previous chapter, the holidays had been a challenge, but we were past that point now. We did what we could as children to care for and support him. I can tell, as I begin to go down that road again writing this, that it's not going to be easy. That familiar feeling in my chest is back as my companion as I type these words and as I read them now. Since January and February are the heart of winter here in the Midwest, there was a weather situation we had to deal with. There were multiple occasions of going in early in the morning to help prepare for a trip to Dad's doctor. At that time, he also had his local physician here in town. I was working at Dahl's at the time, and Brad and Chris were such great guys to work for. They allowed me to go up and help Dad get to his appointments, and then return and get him home again. He was too weak to move easily from his truck to the office. Winter-time conditions complicated things a little, but we always managed. Dad even had a particular pressure that he liked in his truck tires. The first time he requested a certain pressure in each tire, I know I rolled my eyes. Well, okay, I didn't kind of roll my eyes. I really did roll my eyes. As I finished up the last tire, it really got to me though. My dad had a metal rod or two implanted along his spine right now. Riding in a vehicle of any kind had to be painful. If there was anyone in my world who deserved the tire pressure set however they wanted it, it was my dad. Plus, I knew better than to second guess his idea of how tire pressure would affect the ride. If there was anyone who would know, it would be my dad. During that winter, we had quite a bit of snow. I made tracks in fresh snow many times coming into Dad's house. With cancer, it just becomes a time of doing what needs to be done, regardless of conditions. When early February rolled around, we knew he was losing his battle. Hospice was called and things kept changing in ways that still shape my life to this day. The house that Dad lived in was just that to me, a house. I don't mean any respect to Dad and Mom. We all have our stories and trials. I will simply say, any home I had when I was growing up was gone when they divorced. I won't elaborate. You either understand that or you don't. This is the last thing I will say about that. If your parents are still married or remained married their entire lives, I don't expect you to understand, and that's okay. But if your parents divorced, I suspect you understand exactly what I mean. So Dad's house now had a hospital bed in the middle of the living room. Yes, those images will forever stick with me. I've had the honor of visiting with people since those days with my dad who were in a similar situation. It's just not natural for a hospital bed to be in a home. Having it in the living room with your sick father in it is a completely different level of pain. As Dad continued to grow weaker and weaker, we wonder how he was even holding on. The hospice workers told us that it's not common for that to happen. He suggested that we cover anything with Dad that we felt he might be hanging on to here. I left his house on February 3rd wondering what that might be for me. What could it be that Dad was waiting to hear from me? Maybe nothing. But if it was something, what would it be? I thought a lot about that. Did I come up with anything? Well, I think I did. Did it matter in this situation? Well, that's something I'll simply never know. We were visiting on a daily basis at that point, so I returned for a visit the next day, on February 4th. By that time, Dad was so weak that he couldn't even speak. In the days prior to that, he had spoken a little about God and his relationship. That was the first time he had ever brought that up with me in my entire life. He told me about a day when he was maybe 8 or 9 years old. He said there was a church service of some sort. All of his cousins had decided to go forward and accept Jesus as their Savior. He looked me in the eye and said, "I don't know if I did it for God or just because the others were doing it." Then he turned his head away and said, "It doesn't matter. I don't think it stuck." I'll never forget that talk. It only lasted a few minutes, and I can still hear him telling me that story, and I can hear the tone in his voice when he said the word stuck. I don't know why I remember it so well. To this day, I don't feel like I did a very good job helping him navigate that time in his life. It bothers me very much. On the night of February 4th, he could no longer talk to me about that or anything else. He was alert, and if his hand was grabbed, he would give you his full attention. He was still there in the room, and yet he wasn't. As the evening wore on, it got very late. I needed to get home to Julie and the kids. I'd been putting off what I had come up to say to him. It just seemed so final. I didn't want final. What I had to tell him was right in line with all those feelings, though. I stood up from his bedside and I grabbed his hands. Those were the hands I'd always remembered. They looked so much like mine do today. I leaned over his bed so he could see me. What I saw next, I was simply not prepared to see. I just saw the eyes of my dad. It has changed the way I see people's eyes now. You see, when I got close enough to him, I couldn't see the way cancer had changed his body. I couldn't see his body at all. I was too close to see the out-of-place hospital bed that he was laying in. All I could see were those eyes. I'll never forget it. Those eyes looked the same as they had my entire life. They hadn't been weakened by cancer. They were the same color as they were when I had first looked into them from my first memories. It was my dad. Whew. I need a minute, huh? So what did I want to tell him? All throughout my life, Dad had taught me to look out for our family and to take care of the ladies in your life. If they need someone to lean on, they should know they can lean on you. Do the heavy lifting, son. Now, I realize that that's not fashionable like it once was. I also realize my dad didn't always get that right in his own life. So I don't want to get off in the weeds here, but let me just say this. I don't care. I really don't care if it's popular or not. I don't know how to say that more plainly. I also believe that this culture we're creating would be much better off if we'd return to some of that. Being raised that way and having talks with Dad, I wanted to tell him something. So as I leaned over the bed and looked into those eyes, this is what I said. Dad, it's okay. I've got this now. I'll take care of Kel and Ange the best I can. You need to rest. But don't worry about things anymore. I'll take care of the family." I have no idea what he thought of those words, because he wasn't capable of responding. I squeezed his hand. I kissed him on the forehead, and I left. Before sunrise the next morning, Dad had passed from his life on this earth. I'm not saying my words had any effect on that whatsoever. What I am saying is that I'm very glad I had the opportunity to tell him. Yeah, I'm very grateful to God for allowing me enough time to do that. In the years since that day, I've had the honor of assisting families and leading them through the difficult times that come when their loved ones have passed from this earth. I've led hundreds of funerals and spoken at many graveside services. When I go back to the service that we had for Dad, the strange thing is, I don't remember much of it at all. As I mentioned before, that winter was brutal when it came to snowfall. That trend continued into the early days of February. After leaving the funeral home and going to the cemetery, we had to walk through several inches of snow that was on the ground. We had to do it to get to the graveside and to the tent that was waiting. One aspect of that day will always stick with me immediately after leaving the cemetery. Our church family at First Baptist had prepared a meal for us. In our early years of marriage, Julie and I would occasionally receive calls from the bereavement committee. They'd call around and ask members to supply a dish or a casserole of some sort to offer to the family in need. This time, we were the family in need. I took a seat in Fellowship Hall with Julie and the kids, as well as the family gathered for Dad's service. There was fried chicken like there was at most every other church dinner. Now, Luke and Jack have always loved fried chicken, and I was so happy to see them enjoying themselves and moving forward. When I attend a funeral dinner as a minister these days, I usually don't have much of an appetite at that point. Just helping the family through that day still gets to me. And eating, well, it's still not a high enough priority for me, especially when I feel that way. Still, I always try to have a piece of fried chicken. It may sound silly to you, but I do it to honor that church chicken meal the day of my dad's service. I'll never forget how I felt about having our church family caring for us like that. It was very special at that time and has only grown stronger through the years. Each and every church has issues of one sort or another, but I hope that doesn't keep you away. Please read the New Testament accounts of the early church. The Bible even records people struggling for power in the very first churches that were ever formed. Attending church isn't about who gets along and who doesn't. We don't go in order to worship each other. Yes, harmony and loving relationships are best. We had that at First Baptist, and that's the way I felt that day. That's what I felt that day too. It was that feeling that I carry with me to this day. Before I move on from this time in my life and the influence it has had on me, I want to cover one more aspect. We had a visitation for Dad like most families do. It was an opportunity for family from out of town to get here for the service the next day and his friends to come and honor his life. I somehow always manage to get very sick at times like this. I'm certain there's a perfectly good medical reason for it. My best guess is my immune system just takes some time off. I'm rarely sick otherwise, but it seems to do quite well at getting ill when it's most inconvenient to be ill. Dad's visitation was no exception. I was sick. Honestly, I should have stayed home. But that wasn't an option for me. If I could stand up, I'd be there. Standing up for a few hours to greet people is brutal, especially when you feel so sick. At the same time, it's the most beautiful place to be. There was quite a line of people that came to honor my dad. At one point, I looked up and saw several men in line together. It took me a moment, but I finally figured it out. They were the men Dad had fished with from the various bass clubs throughout the years. There were even a couple of them who had come to visit him on one of his stays in our local hospital. I'd never met them before, and I don't know who they are today, but I wish I did. I also wish I had known back then who they were. I'd love the opportunity to send them a card of thanks. If that seems strange to you, please give it some thought. Imagine receiving a note from a person's son or daughter thanking you for honoring their parent by checking in on them. How much would that mean to you to notice, knowing that someone noticed that you cared? Now I hope you see why. I wish I had their names. Their visit meant more than they could ever know. I'd like to try to tell them that anyway. As I stood at the end of the receiving line at his visitation, a man came through that I didn't recognize. That wasn't incredibly unusual since Dad had many relationships that I wasn't aware of. As the man looked me in the eye, I can still hear his simple words. He shook my hand and said, "My condolences." Short and simple, right? As he walked away, my mind raced. His voice sounded so familiar. Who was that? I turned to get a second look, but he was already outside the room. As I replayed his words, it hit me. Oh my gosh, that was Don. Oh no. Don was a guy I worked with at Dolls every single day. How was it that I didn't recognize him? Don's main job was a heavy equipment operator. He wore jeans that were filthy by the end of the day. We all did. We had jobs that were physical labor. That was the norm. We weren't dressed up. The real difference was his hat. At the visitation, he wasn't wearing one. I'd worked with Don for years and hadn't seen him a single time without a hat on. When he went through that line, no wonder I didn't recognize him. But his voice gave him away. But not in time. I'll also blame it on the brain fog that I had going on, and the way I felt, and the fact that it was my father's funeral visitation. I'll give myself a pass on that one, and Don did too, bless his heart. It was my first order of business the next time I was at Dolls. Don's a great guy, and we kind of laughed about it. I told him that he cleaned up pretty well. I told you stories about the Bass Club guys and about Don for a reason. When it comes to supporting people during the loss of a loved one, please show up. The actions of those men have shaped the way that I think of visitations today. It reshaped it completely. I could even offer stories of the reaction that I have received myself from people when I showed up to a visitation and they didn't expect me. Trust me, it's powerful. You do not have to have the right words. And may I tell you something, as a person who attends more funerals than most people? There are no right words. Just show up. Tell you you're there because it's where you want to be. Just show up so they're able to look into your eyes. That may be a memory that they'll never forget. And maybe they will. I can't tell you everyone that came that night. There were family members that came that I hadn't seen in years and I haven't seen since. If someone tells you that's the wrong way to go about life, I'd offer you this. They didn't have to come at all. They chose to. Having them there helped me. That's good enough for me. If you've ever experienced a loss like that, I'm sure you understand the feelings that follow. Some of those thoughts and feelings hit pretty hard and pretty fast. Others settle in over time. Often they alter who we are by changing the way we see things all around us. May I offer an example or two? Just a few weeks after Dad's passing in his services, I had a very strong feeling that I wanted to hear his voice. I have no memory of ever wanting to hear his voice when he was with us. Maybe it's because I always knew he was there when he was alive, so he'd be there tomorrow, right? As it all settled in, I didn't have that option anymore. Yeah, that one hit me hard. So I did call his number. It was the same phone number we'd had in my house growing up. Till I moved out, it was the only number I'd ever known. So I called it. Why? Well, Dad had left his voice on the answering machine. So if no one picked up, well, his voice would be there. It was worth a shot. Yep, his voice was there. At the same time, that was the last time that I ever did that. Those are the type of things that sneak in. I did pick his voice up on a few of the kids' videos, too. It always makes me smile. Since he passed at a relatively young age of 68, his voice was basically unchanged from the voice I'd always known. In a way, it was kind of like those eyes of his. But I've never really thought about that till now. I spent several years a little aggravated at my dad. I tell you that because I'm just being honest. I won't offer all the details. These words are about legacy, looking back and moving forward. That being said, as I went through life after losing him, I didn't have many things sneak up on me after wanting to hear his voice. That all changed just a few weeks ago, though. After 13 years of life without Dad, I still had some things building up and sneaking their way in. I decided I wanted to honor him with a week of posts on social media about the lessons that he had taught me as I grew up. Each day I'd type out a memory or two with the lessons that came along from being Gary Bettis' son. The response that caught me more than a little off guard. It seems there are plenty of people who want to hear those lessons. Some even shared having similar lessons with their fathers. Since I only decided on a Saturday to write those tributes that began the next day on Sunday, the feelings didn't have much of an opportunity to gain momentum. As the week rolled along and the stories came out, those feelings definitely picked up pace. I had no idea when I began that little tribute just how much those posts would reshape the way I reviewed my relationship with my dad. It's been quite a welcome and surprising change, actually. Those little and not so little changes seem alive and well. That's why I say some emotions roll in quickly and others slowly slide in over the years. During those years, I left my job at Dahl's for a while to help manage a warehouse for a local family who runs a small chain of farm and home stores. I'd worked for them previously in their local store. I simply continued to be unsettled in my life. Most of all, I believe it was just a matter of not having peace about who I was. Maybe it was the influence of Red through the years. Maybe all the churning and turmoil around losing Dad kept me moving when I needed to stand still. I'm sure I could pay someone a good fee and they'd offer me their opinion. It just doesn't matter to me anymore. I eventually returned to Dahl's and to concrete work with the Dahl boys. Of course, I still mowed about 20 lawns each week and I kept landscaping. My days with Luke and Jack on Saturdays created memories that we still share today. Those times are absolutely priceless to me. I was speaking as often as they needed me at First Baptist. I even had been asked to fill in as an intern pastor for a small local church. I'd turned them down for several weeks and just filled in as they kept looking. I did take the position eventually, which led me to becoming their full-time pastor. I kept doing all the other things that I was doing. I just took on the responsibility of caring for those beautiful people along with everything else. I hope I passed on some lessons and certainly some love during my time there. I know for certain I learned a lot. Growing in spiritual ways is interesting. It seems to appear when we least expect it to. For me, it appears when I'm in a casual conversation with someone. If you've ever heard that teachers learn more than their students since they have to study it in order to teach it, well, I've found that to be very true. Those Sunday morning messages sometimes come back loud and clear in everyday conversations and just in common life. It's been one of the most powerful testimonies in my own life for all the times that I've found truth in Scripture in a conversation with someone. I've also seen it countless times when no one else was around. Through those years, I wish I could tell you that the disorder lessened as time marched on. The difficult truth is it really didn't. There were times when its hold lessened and times that I truly felt I would be under its power my entire life. Looking back, I definitely do not like the power that I gave it. Yes, I gave it power over some aspects of my life. With a disorder like that, and possibly every disorder, it doesn't stop with the area that it begins. It expands and pushes into territory that you never intended for it to get into. For instance, if we took a short vacation trip as a family, the disorder came along. From the outside looking in, you might assume an eating disorder would be confined to meal times. Well, that assumption would be wrong. It's magnified at mealtime, but it took up space in my thinking all day long. If that sounds absolutely exhausting, well, you'd be right. Maybe that's the reason I began to grow weary of its control. After so many years of fighting it, like a fish on the end of the line, I was just wearing out. Before I wrap up this chapter, I want to mention the radio inspirations. Those continue to run on a weekly basis like they always had. At that time, they were 1 minute long like they had been since the beginning. I would listen for material to come in from many different sources. The material was mostly stories that I was told from people's lives and good quotes as well. Those moments rolled along with the way of life that was flowing all around us. I've always attempted to make them as relevant as I possibly could. 1 minute isn't much time to attempt to add some information and inspiration into someone's life. It was an honor to go to that station once a month and record those moments. As I mentioned previously, I'd been friends with Shippy since high school, but the other friendships that I formed through the years out at the station mean a great deal to me even to this day. I hope I've added to their lives at least a fraction of what they've given to me. I truly do thank God that I survived those years. With the physical nature of my work world, my heart was getting quite a workout. My nourishment improved over time, but it wasn't where it should have been. I was very fortunate to move through my days at work without any complications at all from my choices concerning the disorder. Life at home with Julie and the kids flew by too. I realize almost everyone talks about how quickly the years seem to pass as our children grow up, and I can testify to that truth. With Luke being born in 1996, Jack in 2002, and Jillian in 2006, we always seemed to have something going on. It was a beautiful time, and I've been granted a life that no man can deserve. I am honored to live as I do. My goodness, I married my high school sweetheart. We have 3 beautiful, healthy children. We had them together, and we live in a home that we've always dreamed of. Is there a better way to end a chapter than that? If so, I do not know what it would be. So, on to the next chapter we go.